The geologist's name was Arthur Pell, and he had no reason to care about the cave. He was 38 years old, employed by the Territorial Survey Office, and he had spent the better part of November 1903 crawling through limestone formations west of the settlement, measuring fissures, sketching cross-sections, and recording what the rock told him in the patient language of geology. The cave on the western ridge was simply another data point. He noted the entrance dimensions, roughly 8 feet across, oriented southeast, and ducked inside, expecting the usual cold dark, the faint mineral smell of water, working slowly through stone over centuries. What he found instead made him stop moving. He checked his thermometer twice. He held it near the entrance, then moved it deeper, then held it at chest height near the back wall. 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the afternoon stood at 19 degrees, a pale December sky pressing down on frozen ground. He walked back to the entrance and checked again. 19 degrees at the mouth, 51 degrees 30 feet inside. He wrote the number in his field journal, underlined it, and stared at it for a long moment. Then he wrote a question beside it. Structure inside. He did not know about the double walls. He did not know about the raised floor. The masonry stove, the radiant stone wall, the vestibule designed to strip force from cold air before it reached the living space. He did not know about Clara Holt. He only knew the number, and the number made no sense to him. And he carried it back down the ridge like a stone he could not put down. 12 years earlier, in that same cave, something had happened that the rock still remembered. The rock, as it turned out, remembered everything. Spring of 1890 arrived in northern Montana the way it always did, not warmly, but reluctantly, as though the land had argued with winter and reached only a temporary agreement. The Milk River ran high and fast with snowmelt, its surface deceptively smooth, the kind of calm that had fooled people before and would fool them again. On a morning in late March, when the air still held the bite of frost, but the sun had finally returned some actual heat, James Holt crossed the river at a shallow ford he had used a dozen times before. The water had changed since his last crossing. He made it 3/4 of the way across. Clara learned what had happened from 2 men who rode up to the cabin before noon hats. In their hands, their horses still blowing from hard riding. She understood from their faces before either of them spoke. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her and listened to what they said, and when they finished, she thanked them and asked them to come back the following morning with shovels. Then she went inside, sat down in the chair beside the stove, and put her hands flat on her knees and stayed there until Ruth came in from playing and asked why she was sitting like that. They found James 2 miles downstream, pinned against a fallen cottonwood that had come down in the last flood and lodged in a bend. Clara went with the men who retrieved him. She wanted to see for herself. She had learned early in her life that the things you refused to look at had a way of staying unfinished in the mind, growing larger in the dark than they ever were in daylight. She looked. She said goodbye the way she needed to. They buried him on a Thursday with 8 neighbors present, a minister who had ridden 14 miles to be there, and a sky that was at least clear and pale blue, which felt like the minimum the world owed her. Summer came. People came with it, casseroles, firewood left on the porch without knocking. Offers to look after the children on Sundays so Clara could rest. She accepted the wood. She thanked people for the food. She did not rest on Sundays. She worked because work was the only thing that kept the arithmetic of her situation from running its full calculation in her head at once. She took in mending shirts that needed collars, replaced trousers worn through at the knee, coats that had split at the seams after years of hard use. She sewed by the window where the light was best, and she kept her rates low enough that the loggers and trappers passing through town always chose her overriding another 12 miles to the next settlement. It kept flour on the table. It kept salt pork in the larder. It did not a summer turned. And the days began to shorten, solve the problem that was coming. By August, the sympathy had thinned, the way it always did, not from cruelty, but from the fact that people had their own winters to prepare for their own wood piles to build their own arithmetic to run. Clara understood this. She did not hold it against anyone. She sat with the numbers alone at the kitchen table one evening in September, while Ruth and Owen slept, and she laid out what she had. The cabin needed 9 cords of wood to get through a Montana winter, and that was a mild one. The winter before last had taken 9 and still left ice on the inside of the windows in January. She had money enough for 4 cords, maybe 5 if she pushed through the next 6 weeks without replacing her sewing needles or buying new lamp oil. She sat with that gap between 4 and 9 for a long time. It was not a gap you could work your way across with optimism. The cabin itself was a part of the problem, though she had understood that since the first winter she and James spent in it. It had been built 7 years earlier by a man who cared more about getting a roof over his head before the first snow than about whether that roof would hold warmth come January. Square corners, plank floors with gaps between the boards wide enough to see daylight through a stone chimney that drew cleanly when the wind came from the south and back. Drafted smoke into the room when it came from the north, which was most days from October through March. The walls were single-layered boards over a frame, no insulation, no gap, just wood between the family, and whatever the sky decided to do. In a mild month, it was uncomfortable. In a hard month, it was a liability. She had burned more wood in that cabin than she should have for years. She had watched the heat she paid for rise straight up the chimney and dissolve into the Montana sky. Every cord of wood she bought turned into warmth for approximately 4 hours before the structure shedded like a dog shaking off water. She had known this and had no solution for it, because there had been 2 of them, and James had managed the firewood, and managing the firewood had been its own full-time occupation. That left no room for asking why the system required so much of it. Now she was asking. The question that kept returning, sitting at the table with the lamp burning low to save oil, was not how to get more wood. It was where the heat was going. She thought about the hog barn 3 miles east of town owned by a family named Pritchard. She had been there in February the previous year delivering a mended coat, and she had noticed that the interior of the barn, which housed 8 animals and had no stove whatsoever, stayed above freezing all winter. She had thought about that at the time and filed it away without knowing why. Now she took it back out. 8 large animals, their body heat, low ceiling, thick sod walls. The warmth stayed because the structure held it, not because anyone added more of it. She thought about the root cellar behind the Ashworth place where she had helped put up vegetables in October 2 years running. Underground, stone-lined, no heat source of any kind. Vegetables came out in March still good. The temperature inside stayed between 38 and 45 degrees through the worst cold snaps. The earth itself was the insulation. The earth did not bleed heat outward because there was no surface area exposed to the sky. She thought about the abandoned homestead cabin 6 miles east on the Fowler Road where she had sheltered once during a sudden squall while riding back from a delivery. Stone construction, 1 room. The previous occupant had built a stove from river rock and clay, using some method she had not seen before. The firebox was small. The heat traveled through the stone itself rather than straight up, and the fire had been cold for at least a day when she arrived. But the interior of that stone stove was still warm to the touch in the early afternoon. She had held her hands against it and felt the heat still working its way slowly outward. A fire burned for hours. Its heat stayed in that stone for a day. She was not the kind of person who wrote things down in a journal. She thought in images, in the physical memory of surfaces touched and temperatures felt. She arranged what she knew the way someone arranges furniture in a room, moving things around until the space made sense. Heat went where it was not stopped. Mass absorbed it and released it slowly. Air, if trapped, and still resisted the passage of heat better than almost anything. The cabin failed on all 3 counts. Nothing stopped the heat. Nothing absorbed and held it. Every air gap was a crack that moved cold air in and warm air out. She had been thinking about the cave for several weeks before she let herself think about it directly. She had first seen it 3 years earlier in the late summer, when the choke cherries along the limestone ridge west of town were ripe enough to pick. She had gone out with Ruth, who was 6 at the time, and useful for reaching the lower branches, and they had worked along the base of the ridge through the morning. The cave entrance was easy to miss, oriented southeast into the hillside, half screened by a stand of Douglas fir. The opening no wider than a door frame, and low enough that you had to duck slightly to enter. She had gone in a few feet to check if it was dry, because a dry cave on your land was useful for cold storage. It was not her land. Technically, it was territorial land unclaimed, but that distinction did not change the practical question of whether it was dry. It was more than dry. The back of the cave was bone dry, the stone ceiling smooth and uncracked. No sign of water infiltration, even after the wet spring they'd had. The chamber widened quickly inside, opening to nearly 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose high in the center. The whole thing ran about 40 feet back before the walls closed down. In summer, it was cool. She pressed her palm against the stone of the back wall and felt the chill of it. Not the damp chill of a wet cellar, but the clean, steady cold of deep rock that had never been touched by the season above it. She had thought good for butter and cheese in August. Then she had gone back to picking choke cherries. Now she was thinking about it differently. The cave maintained its own temperature because 60 feet of limestone sat between its interior and the air above. That stone did not fluctuate the way the surface did. It held whatever temperature it reached and changed slowly, seasonally, not daily. In the deepest part, the temperature stayed somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees year-round. Cold in summer, but dramatically warmer than the outside in the worst months of winter. If you were trying to keep 3 people alive in January at 20 below 0, 45 degrees, was not comfort, but it was a starting point that no uninsulated cabin could offer. A cabin in that weather started at 20 below and fought its way up to 50 with a roaring fire. A cave started at 45 with no fire at all. The question was whether you could build the rest of the way from there. She thought about it for 2 more weeks. She walked out to the cave twice, measured the interior with a length of rope, noted where the ceiling was highest, where the floor was flattest, where a chimney could follow a natural fissure upward through the stone. She did not bring anyone with her. She had learned early that half-formed plans invited other people's doubts, and she did not have the energy to manage other people's doubts on top of her own. When she was ready to begin, she would begin. She was ready by the first week of September. The lumber came from the sawmill discard pile, which the mill owner allowed people to take freely because hauling it away cost him time. She picked through it over 3 Saturday mornings, selecting pieces that were warped but structurally sound pieces with knots that had been rejected for finish work but would serve fine for framing. She borrowed a neighbor's wagon twice without asking, because the neighbor, a widow herself who had borrowed Clara's wagon 4 times without asking, would have said yes anyway, and the asking would have cost 40 minutes of conversation neither of them had time for. Clay came from the riverbank below the old ford crossing, the same crossing where James had gone into the water. She did not let herself think about that while she worked. She dug the clay in the early mornings before the day's sowing, began loading it into buckets and covering them with canvas to keep it workable. River stones she gathered from the gravel bars, flat pieces she could lay, rounded ones she could stack, and mortar. From a collapsed homestead foundation south of town, she salvaged cut stone, loading it piece by piece and carrying it in the wagon bed on Sunday afternoons, while Ruth watched Owen in the clearing near the cave entrance. She was not secretive out of shame. She was secretive out of efficiency. Explaining what she was doing would require her to defend it before it was done, and she had no interest in defending something that had not proven itself yet. When it worked, it would need no defense. If it failed, she would have lost a month of Sundays and some borrowed lumber, and she could absorb that. The construction took 8 weeks. She framed the inner room 15 feet back from the entrance, where the ceiling was still high enough to stand under, without stooping, and where the cave walls had narrowed enough to reduce the volume of cold air she would need to exclude. The room was 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet at its highest point, small enough to heat efficiently, large enough that 3 people could live without pressing against each other through a 4-month winter. She had thought carefully about that ratio. A space too small saved on heating, but cost something harder to measure: the ability to move to occupy different corners, to let a child run a few steps when the weather kept them inside for days at a time. The walls went up first. She built them double with 12 inches of dead space between the inner and outer layer. The inner wall was vertical planks, gaps sealed with clay pressed in with her fingers, and smoothed flat, then dried grass and pine needles packed into every crack before a second coat of clay went over everything. The outer wall matched it plank by plank, the gap between them loosely filled with dried grass she had cut in August and laid up to cure. Trapped air was the principle. Still, air resisted heat transfer far better than any solid material of the same thickness, because it had no structure through which heat could conduct. She had not read this in any book. She had reasoned it from the fact that a wool blanket with loft kept you warmer than the same blanket packed flat, and from the way a root cellar stayed stable when the earth itself surrounded it on all sides. The floor she built in 2 layers. First, flat stones laid directly on the cave floor, fitted as tightly as she could manage, mortared with clay, and smoothed so they would not rock underfoot. Above the stones, she built a raised plank floor 4 inches higher, the gap left open at the edges. Cold air, being denser, would sink to the stone floor below the boards. Warm air, the air at breathing height, the air that actually mattered, would stay above. The people in the room would live in the warmer upper layer, without touching the cold stone directly, which would have conducted heat out of them with each step. The ceiling she layered 3-ways boards, then a salvaged wagon cover of heavy canvas stretched flat and tacked to the rafters, then another course of boards above that. Heat rose. It would rise to the ceiling and stay there, captured between the canvas and the upper boards, rather than escaping into the dark upper volume of the cave, where it would dissipate uselessly against cold stone 50 feet overhead. The entrance she oriented backward, facing the rear wall, rather than the cave mouth, so that someone coming in would have to make 2 turns before entering the living space. In front of the door, she built a vestibule 5 feet long, sealed on 3 sides with clay mortared stone, its own small door at the outer end. Cold air, moving fast, lost its momentum in the vestibule. By the time it reached the inner door, it was still, and still air was manageable. She had watched James come in from a February afternoon and seen the cold arrive with him, a sweeping draft that knocked the temperature in the main room down by 10 degrees in less than a minute. The vestibule was the answer to that. 2 doors, a buffer space, and the cold arrived slow and weak instead of all at once. The stove was the piece she had thought about longest. She had seen the masonry stove on the old Fowler Road. She had studied it in the 40 minutes she spent sheltering from the squall, tracing the channels cut into the stone with her fingers, while the rain hammered the roof. The firebox was small, smaller than she expected for the amount of heat the stone retained. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming wood completely, and the heat from that combustion traveled through a series of stone channels before it reached the flue. By the time the gases reached the outside air, most of their heat had been deposited in the stone. The stone then radiated that heat slowly over many hours. You burned 1 fire. The fire lasted 2 hours. The stone worked for 12. She built hers from river stone and clay using the fire brick she had traded 2 months of sewing to acquire. A small firebox 2 feet by 2 feet. 3 channels cut through the stone mass, each one turning the heat back on itself before allowing it to rise. The flue ran up through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling that she packed and sealed on all sides with clay, leaving only the draw opening. Smoke escaped. Heat did not rush after it. Behind the stove, between the stove and the back wall of the cave, she built a second wall of large river stones, mortared thick. This was the radiant wall. It absorbed heat directly from the stove's back surface and from the air around it, storing that heat in its mass and releasing it slowly through the night. 2 heat sources in sequence: the stove and then the wall behind it, each extending the useful life of each fire. She also made a note to keep a pot of water on the stove whenever possible, because warmth that dried the air was not the same as warmth that sustained the body, and she wanted the room to do both. She finished in the first week of November. She stood inside the completed room alone for a few minutes after the last touch of caulking went around the inner door frame, and she let herself feel what the space felt like. The cave temperature at that depth ran about 44 degrees. With the stove unlit and the room sealed, the double walls held that baseline, and the body heat of one person standing still raised it perceptibly within minutes. She could feel it. The room was not warm yet, but it was not cold in the way the cabin was cold. The cabin in November felt like November. This room felt like April. She went back to the cabin and told Ruth and Owen to pack what they needed into the trunk. Ruth, who had watched the construction with the careful attention she gave to most things, asked only one question. Her voice came measured, pitched low the way it always was when she was thinking something through before she said it. Is it going to be warm enough? Clara looked at her daughter for a moment and felt the full weight of the question, which was not really about temperature. Yes, Clara told her. That is what I built it to do. Ruth nodded once the way she did when she was filing something away as settled and began folding her winter dresses. Owen, 5 years old and unburdened by consequence, ran straight into the cave. When they arrived, went to the back wall, put both palms flat against the stone and announced that it was cold. Clara explained that the stone was about to start learning otherwise. Owen thought about this. Can rocks learn? His voice bounced off the limestone, coming back slightly changed. Slowly, Clara told him, but they don't forget. They moved in on a Wednesday, the third week of November, 1890. Everything fit. The table, 2 chairs, the trunk, her sewing supplies, the cooking pots, their 3 winter blankets, and a small shelf of books she had carried from Illinois 11 years earlier when she came west with her parents. The space felt smaller than the cabin by measurement, but warmer immediately, the double walls already beginning to hold the animal heat of 3 people against the cave's stable baseline. That first evening, she built the inaugural fire. 3 logs split medium loaded into the firebox. She watched it catch and settle into the hard, clean burn the small firebox encouraged. Within an hour, the thermometer she had nailed to the inner wall read 62 degrees. Ruth sat at the table doing her arithmetic by lamplight with her coat off. Owen fell asleep on the blankets without complaint. Clara sat by the dying stove and listened to the limestone around her. Not a sound exactly, but a presence. A depth 400 million years of patient stone, doing exactly what stone does, which is hold. Word moved through the settlement the way word always moved, not in announcements, but in fragments. Someone saw her carrying the trunk. Someone else saw smoke from an odd direction on the ridge. A third person put the pieces together and carried the conclusion to the general store, where it became a topic of the kind that small settlements required in order to get through long winters, something to consider, to question, to pass judgment on from the warm safety of one's own 4 walls. Franklin Court said it plainly at the counter one afternoon while buying nails and tobacco. He was 43, a carpenter who had built half the structures in the settlement, and knew in his considered professional opinion exactly how buildings were supposed to work. Underground doesn't circulate air. Mold sets in within a season. She'll flood in spring or suffocate by February. He said this without heat, the way a man states what he takes to be obvious fact. And several people nodded because Court built things and knew things, and there was no immediate reason to disagree with him. Clara was not present for this conversation. She heard about it from the woman who ran the dry goods counter, who told her with a particular kind of sideways apology that suggested she personally reserved judgment but thought Clara ought to know. Clara thanked her and bought a pound of cornmeal and rode back to the ridge. She did not argue. She had made a decision she believed in based on reasoning she trusted, and the reasoning was either right or it was not, and neither Franklin Court's confidence nor her own anxiety would change which one it was. The winter would answer the question. The winter she had found was always willing to answer questions of that kind. It was thorough, it was honest, and it did not care about anyone's opinion of the outcome. December came. Cold settled in steadily the way it did in years that meant business. Not the sharp theatrical cold of a storm front, but the deep grinding cold of a season that had decided to stay. Clara burned 2 logs in the morning and 1 before bed. The thermometer held between 65 and 72 degrees, depending on the time of day, rising after the morning fire, settling slowly through the afternoon, dropping towards 65 by the early hours before the morning fire restored it. She had not anticipated how slowly it dropped. The mass of stone around her absorbed the stove's heat during the burning hours and gave it back through the long, dark hours of night. She had understood this intellectually. Feeling it in practice waking at 3 in the morning and finding the room still at 66 degrees without a fire going was different from understanding it. Outside, December did its work. She heard it from inside the cave, the wind that pressed against the limestone ridge, and found nothing to push. She saw it when she went out for water, or to split the morning's wood, the frost thick on the ground, the breath of the horses in the paddock rising in heavy clouds, the smoke from the settlement's chimneys going straight up in the cold, still air. At her own cave entrance, the wind that swept across the ridge seemed to lose interest before reaching the mouth. She went inside, closed the vestibule door behind her, closed the inner door, and heard the wind as a distant murmur no more urgent than rain on a summer evening. She sewed in the mornings. She managed the stove and the cooking in the late afternoon. Ruth worked on her reading and her figures at the table by the lamp. Owen played on the warm stone floor with the carved wooden animals James had made him 2 winters before, moving them in patterns only he understood, carrying on a quiet narration she could hear but not quite make out. They ate well enough. The wood she was not burning translated directly into food she could buy with what she would otherwise have spent, and she had not fully anticipated that savings either. Then the 6th of January arrived. She noted the change first as a quality of stillness in the air, when she opened the vestibule door to check the morning sky. The kind of stillness that preceded something definitive. The thermometer outside read 9 degrees below zero at first light. By mid-morning, it had dropped to 18 below. By early afternoon, 23 below and still moving. She brought Owen back inside and did not open the outer door again that day. By the following morning, the settlement was at 26 degrees below zero, and it stayed there. This was not a cold snap. A cold snap arrived like a shout and left within days. This came in like a sentence measured complete, impossible to argue with. She burned 3 logs that morning instead of 2. The thermometer reached 78 degrees by midday and settled to 70 by evening. Outside, she knew from the sounds, a distant crack of frozen wood, the way the horses in the paddock had gone completely silent, that the settlement was entering a different order of trouble. She was not without concern, but concern and fear were different things, and she was too busy paying attention to be afraid. The settlement did not collapse all at once. It eroded. That was the more honest word for what the cold did to a community that had prepared reasonably and found that reasonable preparation was not enough. Harold Gunderson was not a careless man. He had laid in more wood than any winter prior had required of him, had stacked it high and dry against the south wall of his barn in October, had felt the satisfaction of a man who had done the math correctly. The math had been correct for every previous winter. This winter was operating outside the range of any math he had done before, and the stack he had been so proud of in October was disappearing at a rate that woke him before dawn each morning with a specific and unambiguous dread. His wife Eleanor pressed heated stones wrapped in flour sacking against the backs of their 3 children while they slept, rotating them out as they cooled, getting up every 2 hours through the night to reheat them on the stove. The stove itself was consuming wood faster than a fire had any right to because the cabin gave nothing back. Every BTU the fire produced went straight into the room. The room gave it straight to the walls. The walls gave it straight to the outside air. And the outside air at 26 below zero had an unlimited appetite. Eleanor Gunderson told her neighbor, Margaret Pollard, on the morning of January 9th through the inch of open doorway they allowed themselves because opening it wider meant losing the heat of the last 2 hours. "We are not going to make it to March if this holds." She said it quietly without drama, the way you state a conclusion you have worked through carefully and do not like but cannot argue with. The cold held. The chimneys were the next problem. Northern Montana winters created temperature differentials that iron stovepipes and stone chimneys handled poorly when pushed past their design tolerances. This winter was pushing everything past its tolerances. The cold outside was so profound that the air at the top of a chimney barely warmed before it was chilled back down, and the draw weakened or failed entirely. 3 families in the settlement woke on the morning of January 11th to smoke-filled rooms, eyes-burning children crying the fire they had so carefully maintained through the night, suddenly their enemy. You opened the door to clear the smoke and lost the warmth in minutes. You closed the door and could not breathe. There was no good option, only less bad ones chosen fast. The Mercer family's youngest spent 2 days after the backdraft incident with a rattling cough that his mother watched with the particular terror of a woman who knew that respiratory illness in a cold house in January was not a small matter. She kept him pressed against her body for warmth, burning through her remaining wood faster than she had planned, because warmth was now medical necessity, not comfort. She counted the remaining cords by feel in the dark, her hand moving over the stacked wood, the way you count money when you suspect you do not have enough and are afraid to look directly at the number. 14 miles west, a rancher froze to death in his barn. He had gone out at midnight to check a calf born 2 days early and in distress. He was found the next morning sitting against the interior barn wall, with the calf in his lap, both of them gone. The story reached the settlement by way of a rider who came through on the 12th, and it changed the quality of the fear people were carrying. Until then, the cold had been a hardship. After that, it was a threat with a documented outcome. Inside the limestone cave on the western ridge, Clara woke on the morning of January 14 to the sound of Owen coughing. It was not a deep cough, not the wet, heavy cough that meant lungs in trouble. It was dry, repetitive, a scratching sound that Owen made in his sleep, without fully waking, his small body curling tighter under the blankets each time it moved through him. She lay still for a moment and listened, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, without panic, with the complete attention that panic would have prevented. The thermometer on the wall read 74 degrees. She crossed the room in the dark and pressed her palm to Owen's forehead. No fever. She put her ear close to his chest and listened to him breathe. The air moved cleanly. His chest was not working hard. He coughed again, twice, and settled. She sat back on her heels in the dark room and made herself think about it honestly. The cave was dry. The stove burned dry wood and produced dry heat. The double walls sealed the space tightly, which was their purpose, but tightly sealed spaces with a heat source and no moisture source produced air that was comfortable by the thermometer and punishing to the respiratory system over time. She had not thought about humidity. She had thought about temperature, mass insulation, airflow management. She had not thought about the fact that the air inside the cave, sealed and heated and recirculated, had been slowly drying out for 6 weeks. She got up and filled the largest pot she owned with water from the bucket and set it on top of the stove, which still held coals from the evening fire. Within 20 minutes, she could feel the moisture beginning to change the quality of the air. A slight softening. The way air feels after the first light rain of summer has wet the dust. Owen coughed once more, stirred, and went quiet. She stayed in the chair until the pot had released most of its water into the room. Then she refilled it, placed it back on the stove, and went to bed. In the morning, Owen ate breakfast without coughing once and asked if he could use the good carving knife to make his wooden bear a saddle, which he declined, and which meant he was entirely well. She had built something she believed in, and it had shown her a gap she had not seen. She filled the gap. That was the work. That was all the work ever was. She kept the pot on the stove from that morning forward, refilling it twice a day. And the air in the cave was different after that, not noticeably to anyone walking in, but perceptibly to the 3 people living there, who slept better and breathed easier and stopped waking with dry throats in the pre-dawn hours. On the morning of January 19th, The 13th consecutive day of temperatures at or below 26 degrees below zero, Reverend Samuel Dre put on every layer of clothing he owned and began making his rounds. He was 51, lean in the way that men who walked everywhere became lean, with a long strided gait that covered ground efficiently and a habit of noting details that most people missed, because most people were thinking about what they intended to say next. He had been a minister for 22 years and had learned that the thing people said they needed and the thing they actually needed were frequently not the same thing, and that the most useful skill he possessed was the ability to distinguish between them by paying close attention to what he observed rather than what he was told. He checked on the elderly first, then the families with young children. Clara Holt was on his list because she was a widow with 2 children living in circumstances the settlement had formed a collective opinion about. And Reverend Dre's experience with collective opinions was that they were wrong often enough to warrant verification. He walked the western ridge with his coat buttoned to the throat and his scarf pulled up over his lower face. He came around the stand of Douglas fir and stopped. Every chimney in the settlement was producing heavy white smoke, the columns rising straight in the still air, monuments to the amount of wood being fed into iron stoves and stone fireplaces to keep interior temperatures at the bare edge of survivable. The ridge above the cave entrance showed a single thin thread of vapor rising from a fissure in the stone, almost transparent against the gray sky, less visible than the breath coming from his own mouth. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. He called out when he reached the cave entrance. Clara appeared from inside the vestibule wearing a wool dress, no coat, her dark hair pinned back. Ruth and Owen followed behind her, Ruth with a book tucked under her arm, Owen with a carved wooden horse in each fist, both children with the pink-cheeked, loose-limbed look of people who had slept long and well. They were not bundled. They were not braced against anything. They looked like children in a house in October. Not like children who had been sealed in a cave for 6 weeks during the worst cold snap in living memory. Clara stepped back and held the vestibule door open. The Reverend ducked inside. The vestibule itself was cool, but still the wind that had been pressing against every exposed surface of his body simply stopped, cut off by the stone walls and the turn of the entrance. He pulled down his scarf and breathed. Then Clara opened the inner door and he stepped through it. He understood in the physical, immediate way that the body understands things before the mind has processed them, that the air in this room was different from any air he had been in for 13 days. Not hot, not the aggressive, slightly desperate heat of a stove being pushed to its limit. Stable. The warmth of a room that had been warm for a long time and intended to stay that way with no particular effort on anyone's part at this exact moment. He turned to look at the thermometer nailed to the inner wall. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. That cannot be right. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Clara followed his gaze. It has been between 78 and 84 all week. I burned 3 logs this morning. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, the way he walked through a space he was trying to understand. He pressed his palm flat against the inner wall. Warm. Not the scorching surface of an iron stove that had been running hard, but warm, the steady warmth of a surface that had been absorbing heat slowly for weeks and was now releasing it at the same pace. He crouched and pressed his palm to the stone floor. The same quality of warmth, deeper, more constant, the kind that came from mass rather than from proximity to a flame. He stood beside the masonry stove and held his hand 18 inches from its surface. The heat that reached him was even directed outward in all directions with no particular intensity at any point. How much wood are you using each day? 2 logs most days. 3 if I am cooking something that takes time. He did the arithmetic without writing it down. 2 logs. He had watched the Gunderson family burn through wood at a rate that would exhaust their remaining supply before February. He had visited 4 other households that morning where the same arithmetic was running. Everyone was burning 6, 8, 10 times what this room required. He looked at the stove. Its surface was warm but calm. The fire inside reduced to coals after 3 hours. How long does the room hold temperature after the fire goes out completely? Clara opened the stove door. Inside, the coal still glowed faintly orange, the fire having been burning since early morning. This one has been going 6 hours. I will add one log before the children go to sleep. If I let it go out entirely overnight, which I have done twice to see what happens, the room drops to 65 degrees and holds there until morning. 65 degrees, with no fire, with 26 below zero on the other side of 60 feet of limestone, and a double wall of dead air insulation, and a raised floor keeping the cold mass of stone from conducting heat directly out of the room's air. He stood very still for a moment and let the full significance of that number arrive. Every cabin in the settlement was working against itself. Burning heat, it produced as fast as it made it, the fire running hard just to stay even with the losses. This room was doing something structurally different. It was retaining what it made. How did you know to build it this way? Clara was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing words that were true rather than words that were impressive. I did not invent any of it. The masonry stove design has been around for generations. Double walls are common in root cellars. Stone holds heat. Anyone who has ever pressed their hand against a south-facing rock in August knows that. I put the pieces together and asked the cave to do the heaviest part. Reverend Dre left the cave and walked directly to Franklin Cord's house, which was a mile south and east. He arrived to find Cord feeding his iron stove, which was working hard enough that Cord had broken a sweat despite the interior temperature of the room being at most 50 degrees. The room smelled of burning wood and effort. "You need to go see Clara Holt's shelter." The Reverend said it without preamble, still standing near the door, his coat not yet unbuttoned. Cord's response was immediate and reflexive, the kind that came from a settled position rather than from thought. "I have heard enough about that cave to last me. She's holding over 80 degrees with 2 logs a day. I just stood in it. I read the thermometer myself." The carpenter stopped moving. He had a log in his hand halfway to the stove, and he held it there for a moment in the suspended way of a man whose working model of the world has just been handed information that does not fit inside it. He put the log down on the hearth slowly and looked at the Reverend with an expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite belief, but something suspended between them, waiting for enough weight to tip it one direction. He went to the cave the next afternoon. He brought 11 people with him, not because he had organized it, but because word that Franklin Cord was going to look at the Holt woman's shelter spread through the settlement in 3 hours and produce the kind of interest that a hard winter generates for anything that might represent an alternative to suffering. Clara opened the inner door and stood back and led them in one at a time, and each person who stepped through that door produced the same sequence stillness. Then a slow turning of the head toward the thermometer. Then a long exhale that was not quite a word. Cord moved through the room with the systematic attention of a man reading a building rather than experiencing it. He examined the joint between the inner and outer wall, where Clara had cut a small inspection port and left it accessible. He crouched and lifted one of the plank floor sections she had made removable for exactly this kind of inspection, looking at the gap beneath the cold air that had settled to the stone floor below the living level. He stood in front of the masonry stove for a long time, not touching it, studying the dimensions of the firebox, the way the flue ran through the stone mass before reaching the chimney channel. Then he asked with the precision of a man asking a technical question rather than conceding a human one. "How long did you make the internal channels, the ones that run the heat through the stone before it exits?" Clara told him. She told him everything he asked, and he asked a great deal, and she withheld nothing. When he was done asking, he stood for another moment looking at the radiant wall behind the stove, the large river stones mortared thick, their surfaces radiating a warmth you could feel from 4 feet away. Then he nodded once, a single compact motion, and went out through the vestibule without speaking further. He did not apologize. Clara had not expected him to and did not want it. Apology would have made the visit about him, and the visit was not about him. The changes that followed moved at the pace that practical knowledge always moved, not evenly, not completely, but in the direction of what worked. Hector Brand, the trapper who lived in a cabin on the north edge of the settlement that caught every prevailing wind, added a double wall to his northern exposure, within a week packing the gap with dried moss and cattle fluff. He did the work himself over 2 long days, working in cold that turned his breath to immediate frost. The wall went up rough and inelegant, but functionally sound. His interior temperature rose 12 degrees. He burned the same amount of wood. He stood in his warmer cabin the first evening, holding his hands in front of the stove, rather than pressing them against it, which was the gesture of a man warming himself by choice rather than necessity. His hands that winter did not crack the way they cracked every other year, and that was a kind of statement. Dottie Marsh drove 3 miles to the cave in the second week of February to look at the masonry stove. She was a practical woman who had been a practical girl before that. The daughter of a stonemason who had taught her the behavior of different types of rock before she was old enough to have opinions about it. She looked at Clara's stove the way her father had taught her to look at stone construction with her hands, as much as her eyes, feeling the density of the mortar, the fit of the fire brick, the way the channels had been cut to resist thermal cracking. She asked Clara to walk her through the sequence of heat movement from firebox to flue. Clara did. Dottie drove home and rebuilt her fireplace into a masonry heater over 4 days using riverstone and clay. Her wood consumption dropped by nearly half in the remaining weeks of winter. The first night she slept through until morning, without getting up to feed the stove. She woke in a room that was 68 degrees and lay still for several minutes, in the unfamiliar luxury of being warm without having worked for it in the past 3 hours. Then she pressed her face into the pillow and let herself cry, and she did not entirely know why, except that she had been very tired for a very long time, and this was the first morning in 4 months that the first sensation upon waking was not cold. Ruth had begun keeping records. She had not been asked to. She had taken it upon herself the way she took most things upon herself, quietly, and without announcement, appearing one morning with a piece of flat slate and a chalk stub, and beginning to write the temperature and the wood count in the corner of the slate each morning, when she woke, and each evening before sleep. Clara noticed and did not comment because Ruth's records were accurate, and the act of keeping them was teaching Ruth something that no one had explicitly decided to teach her. After 3 weeks, the slate was covered, and Ruth asked for paper, and Clara gave her the back pages of a ledger book she had used for sewing accounts. By the end of February, Ruth had 37 days of temperature data, morning and evening readings. Wood consumed ambient notes about wind and sky that told a cleaner story than any single number could. The room had not gone below 62 degrees at any point in the recorded period. The wood consumption across the 37 days totaled less than what most families in the settlement burned in 4 days at the peak of the cold. Owen asked on a morning in the second week of February, when the cold had finally begun to moderate toward merely brutal rather than absolute, why their house was never cold. He was sitting on the warm stone floor with his wooden animals arranged in a semicircle around him. Clara was at the table mending a pair of trousers by lamplight. She told him that the rock around them held onto warmth the way wood held onto water, slowly, with resistance to change in either direction. Owen considered this with the focused expression he used for things that interested him. Does the rock know it is doing it? Clara looked at her son for a moment, the small, earnest face waiting for an answer that was either very simple or very complicated, depending on how you approached it. The rock does what rock does, she told him. It does not decide to, it just does not forget. Ruth looked up from her ledger pages and did not say anything. But Clara saw the information arrive in her daughter's face, the way information arrived there, quietly going somewhere permanent. The fire reached the settlement on the night of February 2nd. The Calloway family had been burning their kitchen stove beyond its intended operating range for 11 days, feeding it past the point the iron could safely handle because the alternative was a room temperature that put their infant daughter in danger. The stovepipe fitting at the elbow nearest the wall had been loose since October, something that Robert Calloway had noted and planned to address in spring, and had not addressed because spring was very far away in October, and the loose fitting had not yet caused any problem that required immediate attention. At 11:30 at night, with the stove running near its limit, and the fitting expanded by sustained high heat beyond its tolerances, the elbow separated. Hot gases reached the wall. The wall caught. The Calloways made it out barefoot, all four of them. Robert carrying the infant and his wife carrying nothing, because she had been asleep 3 seconds before the smoke woke her, and there was no time for anything that was not a body. They stood in the snow 50 feet from the burning cabin in the nighttime air at 15 below zero and watched what was left of their winter go up. Neighbors came out of their own cabins and stood watching with them. Someone brought blankets, someone else brought the family inside. The fire burned itself out by 3 in the morning because the cold was so complete that the structure, once its interior fuel was consumed, could not sustain combustion against the weight of the outside temperature pressing in. Clara learned about it the next morning from Hector Brand, who came to the cave on his way back from the site. She stood in the vestibule and listened to him describe what he had seen: the foundation stones, the chimney standing along the ground around it, black where the snow had melted and then refrozen over the ash. He told her the family needed somewhere to go while the settlement figured out what to do with them. He said it carefully, not quite as a question. There were 7 people in the cave room that night: Clara, Ruth, Owen, Robert, and Helen Calloway, their infant daughter, and Helen's mother, who had been staying with them since November. The infant cried for an hour and then slept. The adults arranged themselves on the floor, and the 2 chairs and the trunk, and Clara put 2 extra logs in before closing the stove for the night. She woke twice to check the thermometer. It did not go below 68 degrees. 7 people, 2 extra logs beyond her usual ration, 14 below zero outside. The room held. Robert Calloway lay awake on the floor in the dark, listening to his infant daughter breathe steadily in the warmth, and he felt the heat of the stone working upward through the plank floor into his back. And he understood with the clarity that loss and cold together can produce that he had been living inside a system he had never examined, and that the system had failed him at the worst possible moment, and that the alternative to that system was here around him, holding 68 degrees with no particular effort, while the world outside sat at 14 below. He did not say anything. He lay in the warmth of the cave and listened to his daughter breathe, and let the fact of her breathing be enough for the moment. Some understandings arrive not as revelations, but as a long quiet settling, like stone cooling after a fire, taking the shape of what surrounds them and keeping it. A second chimney collapsed on February 7th. The Henderson Place, 5 days after the Calloway fire, a thermal crack propagating through the mortar in the night. Smoke entering the wall space and then the room. The family evacuated. No one was hurt. But something shifted in the settlement after 2 structural failures in less than a week. People stopped visiting each other entirely. The calculus of a door opening had changed. Not just the warmth lost, which was real and measurable, but the psychological weight of it. The acknowledgement that your reserves were finite and the winter was not. Survival became private, which is what it becomes when there is not enough of it to share. Inside the cave, the remaining weeks of winter developed a routine that had the quality of something durable. Clara sewed by the lamp in the mornings. She managed the stove and the meal at midday and evening. Ruth kept her records and read and did her figures with a concentration that had deepened through the winter, sharpened by the specific attention that an enclosed space produces in a child who has learned to find the interior of a place genuinely interesting. The wood pile outside the vestibule door shrank slowly. Clara checked it every few days, not with anxiety, but with the professional interest of someone monitoring a system she had designed and trusted, but wanted to verify. It was shrinking at exactly the rate she had predicted in September. She had planned for 4 cords. She was using 4 cords. The storm that had broken other people's plans had not broken hers because her plan had been built around a different question than theirs had. They had asked how much wood they needed. She had asked where the heat went. Spring came to northern Montana the way a debt gets paid, not generously, not with any warmth toward the creditor, but because the season had run its course and there was nothing left to do but settle accounts. The snow pulled back from the southern exposures, first revealing ground that was black and matted. The grass beneath it flattened and pale, pressed into the earth by months of wait. The Milk River ran high again with snowmelt, the same surge that had taken James Holt 14 months earlier, and Clara watched it from the ridge one morning in late March, without the acute grief of the first spring and without the numbness of the second. She watched it the way you watch a thing that has become part of the landscape of your life, present acknowledged, no longer requiring a response. The settlement emerged from winter the way survivors always emerge, slowly blinking, taking inventory of what remained. 11 people dead across the surrounding counties, 6 from exposure, 3 from the 2-cabin fires, 2 from smoke inhalation when chimneys failed in the night and the families did not wake fast enough. Livestock losses ran into the hundreds. Several homesteads sat empty, their owners having retreated east, following the instinct that said the margin here was too thin and the winters too honest about what they required. In the settlement itself, no deaths. Losses, certainly woodpiles gone to the last stick, food stores drawn down harder than planned, 2 structures requiring significant repair. But everyone who had been alive in October was alive in April, and that fact, measured against the 11 dead in the counties around them, carried a weight that people felt without quite being able to articulate. Clara's woodpile was the answer that traveled fastest. 3 cords remaining from a starting stock of 4.5. Every person who walked past the cave entrance stopped first at the woodpile and stood there doing the arithmetic of it, comparing it against their own depleted stores, against the memory of the last weeks of January, when the gap between what they had and what the winter required had been visible and terrifying. The numbers did not require explanation. They sat in the thin April air as plain as the limestone ridge, and they said something that no argument could unsay. Vera Olson came in the first week of April with her husband Carl, who said almost nothing through the entire visit, but whose eyes moved over every surface of the cave room with the focused attention of a man who builds things and is looking at something built better than he would have built it. Vera ran her hand along the inner wall where the clay and grass packing showed at the inspection port, pressing her fingers into the material with the assessing pressure of someone who knew what insulation was supposed to feel like. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the flatness of a verdict rather than a conversation. This is smarter than anything we put up when we first came out here. We have been doing it wrong, and this is what right looks like. Carl nodded without speaking. He measured the vestibule with the length of rope he had brought in his coat pocket and the depth of the wall gap at the inspection port with his thumb and forefinger. He noted all of it without writing anything down. The Olsons rebuilt their home that summer. Double walls with a 14-inch gap packed with dried grass and wood shavings. A stone floor in the main room with a raised plank floor above it. A masonry stove in the back wall following the design Clara sketched for them on a piece of brown paper that Carl folded and kept in his shirt pocket through the entire construction. Their first winter in the rebuilt house, they burned 60% less wood than they had burned the previous year and maintained a higher average interior temperature throughout. Carl built a second masonry stove for a neighbor the following spring and did not charge for his labor, which was the closest he came to saying publicly what he thought about what Clara had given them. Franklin Cord came to the cave again in April, alone in the morning. The February visit had been about the stove. This visit was different in quality. He stood in the cave room for longer than any question required, looking at the radiant wall behind the stove with the attention of a man revising something he had held as settled. He had built fireplaces for 11 years, on the same principle: combustion, direct radiation, open flue. The principle was not wrong. It was incomplete. An open fireplace turned most of its fuel into the draft that carried the smoke out, and the heat went with the smoke, and the room got the remainder. The masonry stove turned that ratio around. The heat stayed. The smoke was incidental. He had understood this conceptually in February, standing in the cave in April with the stove unlit and the room still at 64 degrees on a cold spring morning. He understood it in the way that changes what you do afterward. He asked 3 more technical questions about mortar mix and channel dimensions. Clara answered all 3. When he was done, he stood for a moment looking at the room. The small, unremarkable room inside a mountain that had held 3 people through the worst winter in memory, on a fraction of the fuel anyone else had burned. And he said, "You built the right thing." He said it the way a craftsman acknowledges craft without warmth and without condescension, as a plain statement of observed fact. Then he left. Every structure Franklin Code built after the winter of 1891 had thicker walls than his previous work. He developed his own version of the double-wall system, adapted to above-ground construction, with modifications that improved on what Clara had done in ways she was glad to see. He used stone floors in key rooms. He specified masonry heaters over open fireplaces as a matter of professional standard. When clients asked him why, he told them it was thermal efficiency basic physics, the right way to build for this climate. He named no sources. Clara did not need him to. The walls named her every winter they held warmth against a Montana sky. The knowledge spread the way practical knowledge has always spread, not in books, not in formal instruction, but through hands and observation, and the specific urgency of people who had been cold and did not intend to be cold in that particular way again. Hector Brand told 2 other trappers about the double wall modification. One tried it, one did not. The one who tried it told his brother, who built a new cabin the following year, with the principle incorporated from the foundation. Dottie Marsh became, without intending, to a regional authority on masonry stove construction. She had rebuilt her fireplace in February and spent the remaining weeks of winter living with the results and understanding them. And by spring, she could explain the heat channel principle with the clarity that comes from 40 consecutive days of direct observation. 3 families came to her before summer, asking for guidance, and she walked them through it the way Clara had walked her through it completely, without reservation, holding nothing back. The knowledge was not hers to sell. She had received it without payment, and she passed it on the same way. The schoolhouse that Constance Merrill had been fighting to have built for 2 years finally went up in the spring of 1892, and Merrill used the leverage of the previous winter's near disasters to push through specifications that the school board would not have approved a year earlier. Double walls, stone floor in the main room, a masonry heater rather than the cast iron stove that had been in the original plan. The schoolhouse was warm from its first November. Children removed their coats indoors, which had not been possible in any of the temporary teaching spaces the settlement had used before. Attendance improved through January and February compared to previous years because children were no longer losing partial days to cold-related illnesses that drafty under-fired spaces reliably produced. Clayton Hayes rebuilt his horse barn using a masonry heater in the central aisle designed to radiate evenly along both sides. He had lost 4 horses the previous winter, not to the cold directly, but to the cascade of problems that severe cold produced in animals that were stressed and underfed because the cold had made everything harder. He built the new barn heater himself over 6 weeks in the summer, using Clara's stove as his model. The barn came through the next 3 winters without a loss. Hayes told people it was the heater. The heater told anyone who stood near it on a January morning exactly what it was doing and why, which was the simplest form of instruction. By 1895, more than 30 structures within a 50-mile radius reflected Clara's principles in some form. Not one of them bore her name. Not one of them was documented in any record that connected the design back to its source. The knowledge existed in walls and floors and stoves, in the decisions of builders who had seen what worked and incorporated it into what they built thereafter, in the warmer rooms of people who no longer woke before dawn to feed a fire that was losing the race against their walls. It was the kind of knowledge that a practical culture embeds in its practice, rather than in its literature, passing it forward through the thing made rather than through the story of who made it. Clara lived in the cave for 6 years. In the spring of 1896, when Ruth left for her first teaching position 30 miles east, and Owen had grown into the capable independence of a 16-year-old who no longer needed a cave for his survival. Clara walked out of the cave on a morning in April, stood in the thin spring light, and looked at the entrance for a long moment. 6 years. She had gone in as a woman with a problem, and no solution, with 2 children, and 4 cords of wood, and a winter that had not yet shown what it intended. She was coming out with something harder to measure, the knowledge of how to hold what you were given, and the proof that the knowledge worked, and the understanding that proof was its own kind of answer to everyone who had stood at a general store counter and explained why it could not. She built a house in town. She built it herself with Owen's help and the assistance of 2 men she paid in sewing work, and she built it the way she had learned to build double-walled stone floor in the main room, a masonry stove along the north wall where the cold came hardest. The house was small, 4 rooms, a single story. It was the warmest house in the settlement by any measure, and it was not close. She had spent 6 years inside a mountain learning exactly what she needed to learn to build it, and it showed in every wall she raised and every stone she laid. The cave on the western ridge did not sit empty. Trappers used it through the 90s and into the next century, finding it without knowing its history and valuing it without understanding why it held its temperature better than any natural cave they had sheltered in before. A man named Aldous Finch, who ran a trap line along the western ridge for nearly a decade, told anyone who would listen that the cave was the finest emergency shelter in the territory. Not because of anything he had built, but because of what was already there when he arrived. He did not know who had built the double walls or raised the floor or constructed the masonry stove that could be brought back to life with minimal fuel after months of disuse. He assumed it had been there a long time because things built well feel permanent in a way that makes their recent origins seem implausible. Ruth grew into her work the way her mother had grown into hers, through patient attention to what was actually needed rather than what was assumed to be needed. She taught arithmetic in the settlement school, the same schoolhouse with the double walls and masonry heater that Constance Merrill had insisted on, and she taught it with the conviction of a person who had spent a childhood watching someone she loved use real numbers to solve real problems and understood in her bones that mathematics was not an abstraction but a tool. She taught her students to ask what the number meant before they calculated it and what they intended to do with the answer after. She never explained where she had learned to think that way. It was simply how she thought, and teaching was the transmission of how you thought. And so it passed forward into students who would carry it into their own lives without knowing its origin, which was exactly how useful things traveled. Owen built houses. He had watched his mother build one inside a mountain when he was 5 years old. And the memory of it, the warmth of the stone floor under his hands, the way the heat stayed without a fire working to maintain it, the quality of the air that was different from every other interior he entered, as a child became the standard against which he measured everything he subsequently built. When clients asked him why his specifications differed from conventional practice, he told them that a building's job was to hold what it was given, and that most buildings failed at this job not through dramatic collapse, but through the steady, invisible bleeding of warmth through surfaces that had never been designed to hold it. When they pressed him further, looking for something more technical, he sometimes said only what his mother had told him on a February morning in a cave when he was 5 years old and curious about the dark rock around him. The stone remembers. People usually took this as the kind of thing builders said to make their craft feel like art. Owen let them think that. He knew it was not a metaphor. Clara Holt died in March of 1924. She was 65 years old. Ruth was at her bedside. Owen came from 40 miles away and arrived 2 hours after she had already gone. The way these things often happened when the distances were real and the notice short, and he sat with her for a while anyway, because the distance between present and gone was not one he was ready to treat as absolute. There was no public ceremony. People who had known her came to pay their respects at the house, the warm house, the house that required no explanation to anyone who stepped inside it in January. They said what people say. They meant most of it. Her name faded from common reference within a generation, the way names do when the person who carried them is gone, and the knowledge they demonstrated has moved into walls and floors, and the practiced habits of builders who learned from builders who learned from her. What did not fade was the cave. Arthur Pell had recorded his measurement in December of 1903 and included it in his survey report as an unexplained anomaly. He carried the number with him for years afterward, returning to it the way you return to an unresolved question, not with urgency, but with the persistent awareness of something that had not yet been given an adequate answer. He never found one that fully satisfied him. The geothermal contribution was real but insufficient. The cave's orientation helped, but could not account for the full differential. There was something structural he had not examined, because he had not known to look for it, and by the time anyone looked, the inner room had been there long enough that it felt permanent, which is the highest compliment you can pay to something built to endure. What Pell had actually measured without knowing it was the sum of 6 winters of habitation. 6 years of a small fire burning twice a day, releasing heat into the surrounding stone, the stone absorbing it slowly and releasing it slowly, the way stone always does. Clara had been gone from the cave for 12 years when he stood there with his thermometer. The cave had been holding the heat of her residency for all 12 of them, bleeding it back into the air a fraction of a degree at a time, still warmer than it had any geologic reason to be. Not because of some anomaly in the rock, because a woman had understood how heat moved and had built a system that moved with it rather than against it, and the rock had learned the lesson she taught it and had not yet finished teaching it back. Warmth is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It exists in the absence of cold, in the unnoticed comfort of a room that maintains itself through the night, in the sleep of children who do not wake shivering in the hands of a woman who runs thread through a needle in January without having to warm her fingers first. Clara Holt did not fight the winter. She had watched what happened to people who fought it and understood that the winter was not a thing you defeated. It was a condition you learned to inhabit correctly, and the learning required paying close attention to what was actually happening rather than what you assumed was happening, and then building a response to the real thing rather than the assumed one. She had paid attention. She had built accordingly. And for 6 years, while the Montana sky pressed down on everything beneath it with all the patience of a season that did not negotiate, a small room deep in a limestone ridge held its warmth against the cold, with a steadiness the cold itself could not match. Not through force, not through an inexhaustible supply of fuel, through understanding the specific hard-won, irreplaceable understanding of a woman who had asked where the heat went and followed the answer all the way to its conclusion. The stone around her had learned what she taught it. Limestone does not forget. It absorbs and it holds. And when the season turns and the world outside grows cold again, it releases what it was given slowly, steadily, for as long as it takes.